For the remainder of Term 4, we're looking at our Human Impact Unit. To start, we're looking at Life Science 2-1, which looks at the interactions, energy, and dynamics of our ecosystems. When you see that standard, what comes to your mind? Pause the video and think about anything that comes to your mind when you think of an ecosystem. Remember to write your thoughts on a piece of scratch paper, so when you're done with this video and this slideshow, you'll be able to compare what you came in with and what you learned through this video. By the end of the week, you should be able to analyze and interpret data to provide evidence for the effects of resource availability on organisms and populations of organisms in an ecosystem. That means this unit involves multiple graphs and visual representations. You'll never need to create your own graph. The graph will always be provided to you, but you will have to answer questions to interpret the data that's shown in a graph. We have two essential questions for this week. The first, what is the main purpose of organisms in an ecosystem? And the second, why is ecological stability in an ecosystem so important? Think about these questions and pause your video to try to brainstorm some answers to 1 and 2. You may have heard the word ecosystems before. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms and the non-living components of their environment interacting as a system. On the left, you can see one ecosystem found in a forest, and on the right, a very different ecosystem found in a marine or coral reef. The biotic and abiotic components are linked together through nutrient cycles and energy flows. You can't have one without the other. Biotic components include all living things. This includes plants and animals, but also fungus, bacteria, and protists. Abiotic things include water, soil, air, minerals, and light. Abiotic factors can include many other things, but these are some general examples. Living things cannot live without non-living things. So this visual shows our biotic factors, our plants and animals, and now our abiotic factors being added to the system to create our balanced ecosystem. Those biotic factors can be simplified even further into organisms. Although they are not synonyms, an organism is any living thing. Organisms include single cells, plants, animals, fungi, or anything that you can think that is alive. When multiple organisms of the same species are together, we call that a population. This is a visual of a population of monarch butterfly. They're all in the same area at the same time, and they're the same species. This picture at the top, including many different animals, is not a population because they're each a different species. A population must be the same species. If we look at populations with a scientific lens, we want to consider two major things. The first is population density. Population density is the number of individuals in any unit of area. When you did the grasshoppers simulation for part 1 of this week, you were estimating the population density of grasshoppers in 1 acre of land. For number 2, we also are looking at population growth. This can be affected by many things, including birth, death, and migration. If the number of births and the number of deaths is the same in an area, then your population size will stay constant and will not increase or decrease. However, that doesn't really happen in nature. This graph shows a very generic idea of population growth. As our growth rate is increasing, we can see our trend is going up. Our number of individuals is increasing over time. When it gets to this point, our growth rate begins to decrease and ultimately plateau at our carrying capacity. We'll talk about carrying capacity later on in this video. The things that affect our birth, death, and migration rates are directly linked to our resources. A resource is a substance or object in our environment required by an organism for normal growth, maintenance, and reproduction. When a resource is consumed by one organism, it becomes unavailable to another organism. We are each competing for those resources. A resource is always limited. There is no resource that is unlimited in an ecosystem. Resources can be from a living thing or from a non-living thing. Our biotic resources are primarily our food source. So based off your diet, your biotic resources are listed on the screen. Abiotic resources can be water, sunlight, soil, territory or space, air, and temperature. There are other resources out there, but these are just some major ideas to keep in mind. Look at the food web on your screen. If energy is getting passed upwards as each organism eats the resource below, then each arrow is representing the energy passing from one organism to the next. If one resource decreases or goes way down, we want to think how that's going to affect the other plants and animals in this food web and this ecosystem. In this example, if mice got sick one season and their population decreased, how would that affect the other species in the ecosystem? Pause the video and try to answer questions 1, 2, and 3 on your paper. Snake are a major predator for the mice. So if the mice decrease, now the snake have no food source. So our snake population is going to be directly affected. Since you can see only one arrow going toward the snake, that means that the snake only has one food source. So if their one food source, the mouse, decreases or goes away, the snake will either need to find another food source, maybe try to consume small rabbits or frogs, or the snakes will die. For question 2, how does it affect our plant species? The grass, again, will be directly affected by the mouse because the arrow is pointing directly from the grass to the mouse. If that resource, the mouse, decreases, now the grass has one less predator. So the grass population might increase. However, this time the grass has 4 different arrows pointing away from it. So the grass is still consumed by the deer, the rabbit, and the cricket. If the mice disappear, the grass still have 3 predators that will be consuming it, so it might not be affected as significantly as the snake. If you look at the cricket, we consider the cricket a competitor to the mouse. So if the mouse resource decreases, the cricket might have more of its food resource, the grass, available to it. So maybe the cricket population will increase slightly as a result. These are 3 simple relationships in a food web, but look at the other plants and animals in this ecosystem and try to consider how just eliminating one resource might have a domino effect and affect the other organisms in the ecosystem, even if the arrow does not point directly from the mouse to another. So we know if we reduce a resource, it'll negatively affect a lot of plants and animals, and it will impact the entire ecosystem. What about if you increase a resource? You might assume that increasing resources will always be a good thing no matter what. But remember, to have a healthy balance of all organisms in an ecosystem, you can't have a surplus of one or another. We want a balanced, diverse community. In this visual, going left to right, we have year 1, just an average year. Year 2 became very warm, and year 3 was very cold. Over these 3 years, we can see the effects of having a community dominating by one species, either green or blue, compared to a diverse community containing both of these species. Over time, look at how each of these different ecosystems is affected. Our diverse community is the only one that both of our species will exist throughout all 3 years. It might shift from one to the other, but they are both always present and able to survive. The community dominated by blue species was very successful in an average year, but when it was warm, our resource, our population, decreased. When it got cold, they came back and they dominated the area again, which is the opposite of the green species. It was able to exist very comfortably in an average year, but then in the warm year, our species was very, very successful. And then in the cold year, they decreased significantly. Think about what this would do to the full ecosystem if that species was to disappear or decrease significantly if there's no other species to take its place. The resources that we need to survive are one example of a limiting factor. Limiting factors are anything that limits a population size from growing excessively or too high for the ecosystem to sustain. So your population size can be limited by many things, including competition, predation, parasitism and disease, unusual weather, and natural disaster. It can be limited by other things as well, but these are some general ideas of things that affect all populations and limit all populations. Limiting factors can be grouped into the resources or other factors that are unrelated to resources, such as the disease, weather and seasons, natural disasters, and even human disturbance. All of these limit the growth of any population in nature. For a plant to be able to go through photosynthesis to produce its own energy, it needs many things, including light, carbon dioxide, and a healthy temperature range. If these resources and factors go out of the healthy range, it can negatively impact the plant. Notice the temperature specifically. If the temperature is too low, our rate of photosynthesis is very unsuccessful. The rate is very, very low. Then it increases at this nice healthy range. Any of this time, our photosynthesis is successful. But once it reaches too high of a temperature, it drops down dramatically. There's a healthy range, and the limiting factor is the temperature in this graph. Another example is the blue crabs in our Chesapeake Bay. Watch the video that's 1 minute and 30 seconds, and then open the link about our Chesapeake Bay blue crab population changes to try to answer these questions. Notice that in 1995 to 2002, the population decreased significantly. How did you know that it would be temperature, human hunting, and natural predation that were affecting the population in that way? What did we call those things? We call those our limiting factors. They are affecting the population size of our blue crabs. Remember at the beginning of this video, we mentioned carrying capacity. The carrying capacity of any population is the population size of the species in an area, given those limited resources that we've discussed. This is the balanced status of an ecosystem. Notice this graph. Our population size was increasing at a steady rate, and then it began to decrease and plateau. It cannot surpass the carrying capacity line. If our population is way up here, the ecosystem cannot sustain that for very long, and that species will outcompete other species in the ecosystem or throw off the balance in some other way. This visual of our goldfish just shows a very basic example of that. Given the space, the amount of water, the amount of oxygen and food, this ecosystem can only sustain 3 goldfish. It cannot sustain more than that. The carrying capacity is very clear here. In this visual, you can see carrying capacity is this orange line. Notice that my population in green has been increasing at a steady rate at initial growth, and then it is plateauing generally at the carrying capacity line. It's the environmental resistances, those limiting factors and lack of resources that prevent our population from going above our carrying capacity. Notice it goes slightly above and then back down. In nature, nothing is perfect. It will not just stay at the carrying capacity line, but it'll hover around that area. Growth and survivorship determines our 2 types of organisms. Humans are a K-selected species. That means that we hover around the carrying capacity, which is known as K, in our ecosystem. We also have a survivorship curve of type 1, which means that throughout your life you have a very stable and constant state of healthiness until the end of your life, when humans tend to get diseases and die of natural causes. But we have a very long lifespan. Compared to an R-selected species, such as a fish or even a small bunny and a small mouse, would be R-selected. That means they have many, many offspring each time they reproduce, but they can be affected more directly by small changes to the ecosystem. their populations fluctuate around the carrying capacity.